In the hushed grandeur of St. Margaret's Church, beneath stone arches that had witnessed centuries of vows, Josephine Hartley stood in borrowed white silk, her lips trembling with words that would destroy her. The congregation held its breath as she turned to face not her groom, but the magistrate who had interrupted the ceremony. "I confess," she whispered, her voice carrying through the sacred space like a death knell. "The theft was mine alone." But those who knew her eyes saw the truth she could never speak. She was innocent, and the man whose crime she claimed stood mere feet away, his hand clasped in his brother's, watching her sacrifice herself for sins that were never hers to bear. If you are listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The autumn of 1878 brought with it a peculiar golden light to the Yorkshire countryside, the kind that made even the sternest manor houses appear almost welcoming. Thornfield Hall stood at the edge of the moors, its grey stone facade softened by climbing ivy that had grown wild over decades. It was here that Josephine Hartley had lived for all of her 22 years, the eldest daughter of the estate's late steward, raised in the careful shadow of privilege that was never quite her own. She moved through the servants' corridors with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned early that invisibility was a virtue. Her dark hair was always neatly pinned, her grey eyes downcast, her movements precise. The household staff called her Miss Josephine, out of respect for her father's memory, but she knew her place was somewhere between the drawing room and the kitchen, a liminal space occupied by those whose education exceeded their station, but whose birth prevented them from ever truly belonging. The current master of Thornfield, Lord Edmund Ashworth, had been her father's closest friend. When consumption had taken both of Josephine's parents within a year of each other, Edmund had insisted she remain at the estate, serving as companion to his elderly mother, Lady Catherine. It was an act of charity disguised as employment, and Josephine was painfully aware of the debt she owed. "You are wool-gathering again, child," Lady Catherine's voice cut through her thoughts. The old woman sat by the drawing-room fire, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid despite her 70 years. "I asked you to read the letter from Edmund. He writes that he is bringing a guest from London." Josephine retrieved the letter from the escritoire, unfolding the heavy paper with careful hands. Edmund's handwriting was bold and decisive, much like the man himself. "He says his friend, Mr. Julian Ashworth, will be staying through the Christmas season. He hopes the country air will be beneficial to his constitution." Julian Ashworth? Lady Catherine's eyes narrowed. "That would be Edmund's cousin from the London branch. I have heard of him. A barrister of some repute, though there was talk of him withdrawing from several high-profile cases unexpectedly." She waved her hand dismissively. "No matter, we shall receive him properly. You will ensure the blue guest room is prepared, and instruct cook to plan menus suitable for a gentleman of refined tastes." "Of course, my lady." Josephine made a note in the small leather journal she kept for household management. She had long ago learned that anticipating Lady Catherine's needs was the surest way to maintain peace in the household. The letter continued with news that made Josephine's stomach tighten with apprehension. Edmund wrote that he had finally decided to fulfill his duty to the family name. At 35, he could no longer delay the matter of producing an heir. He had selected a bride from among the suitable young ladies of the county, Miss Arabella Thornton, daughter of Sir Charles Thornton, whose estates bordered Thornfield to the east. "An excellent match," Lady Catherine declared when Josephine finished reading. "The Thorntons have impeccable lineage, and Arabella is said to be accomplished in all the necessary arts. Edmund has chosen wisely." Josephine murmured her agreement, though her heart felt strangely heavy. She had known this day would come. Edmund was a good man, responsible and kind, but he lived in a world of obligations and expectations. Marriage was simply another duty to be fulfilled, like managing the estate or sitting in Parliament. She had no right to feel the small ache of loss that settled in her chest. The following week brought a flurry of activity to Thornfield. The guest room was aired and furnished with fresh linens. The silver was polished until it gleamed. Cook consulted with Josephine daily on elaborate menus, featuring game from the estate and delicacies ordered from London. The entire household hummed with the energy of preparation. Edmund arrived on a Thursday afternoon, his travelling coach pulling up to the main entrance just as the autumn sun began its descent toward the horizon. He emerged first, tall and distinguished in his travelling cloak, his brown hair touched with grey at the temples, though he was still in the prime of life. His face, weathered by outdoor pursuits and responsibility, broke into a warm smile when he saw Josephine waiting with the household staff to greet him. "Miss Hartley," he said, taking her hand in both of his, "it does my heart good to see you. I trust my mother has not been too demanding in my absence." "Lady Catherine has been the model of good health and temperament," Josephine replied, the familiar warmth of their easy friendship settling over her. Edmund had never treated her as merely a servant, always acknowledging the education her father had provided her, the books they had discussed over the years. "You were always a diplomatic liar," he said with a laugh, before turning to assist his guest from the coach. The man who emerged was a study in contrast to Edmund. Where Edmund was solid and dependable in appearance, his cousin Julian Ashworth possessed a kind of restless elegance. He was perhaps a year or two younger, with dark hair that fell carelessly across his forehead, and eyes of such a startling blue they seemed almost unnatural against his pale complexion. He moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to the drawing rooms of London, his clothes cut in the latest fashion, his manner suggesting both charm and a hint of something darker, something weary. "Julian, allow me to present Miss Josephine Hartley, my mother's companion and the most capable manager Thornfield has ever known," Edmund said. "Miss Hartley, my cousin, Mr. Julian Ashworth." Julian took her hand and bowed over it with a formality that seemed almost mocking. "Miss Hartley, Edmund has written of you often. He says you are the only person who can truly manage his formidable mother." "Lord Ashworth exaggerates my influence," Josephine replied, withdrawing her hand as quickly as courtesy allowed. There was something unsettling about Julian's gaze, as if he saw too much, understood too well the uncomfortable space she occupied in the household. "I never exaggerate," Edmund said firmly. "Now come, Julian. Mother is eager to see you and tea is waiting." The following days established a new rhythm at Thornfield. Edmund was often away during the daylight hours, either managing estate business or calling upon the Thorntons to court his intended bride. Julian, claiming his health required rest and country air, spent his time in the library or walking the moors, often returning with muddy boots and a distracted expression. Josephine found herself frequently in his company, as Lady Catherine insisted that their guest not be left to his own devices. She would sit in the library while he read, managing correspondence or mending linens, maintaining the proper silence of her position, but Julian seemed determined to breach that silence. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," he said one afternoon, closing his book with a decisive snap, "do you approve of my cousin's impending marriage?" The question startled her. "It is not my place to approve or disapprove of Lord Ashworth's choices." "That is not an answer." Julian leaned forward, his blue eyes intense. "You have known Edmund for years. Surely you have an opinion on whether he should bind himself to a woman he barely knows for the sake of duty and bloodline." "Marriage among people of rank has always been a matter of practical consideration," Josephine replied carefully. "Miss Thornton is by all accounts accomplished and well-bred. She will make an excellent Lady Ashworth." How diplomatic, how utterly meaningless. Julian stood and began to pace, his restless energy filling the room. "Do you know why I left London, Miss Hartley? Why I abandoned a thriving practice and retreated to the country like a wounded animal?" She remained silent, sensing that he needed to speak more than he needed her response. "I defended a man I knew to be guilty," Julian continued, his voice low and bitter. a nobleman accused of embezzlement from his own tenants. The evidence was damning, but his family hired me to create doubt, to manipulate the jury, to twist the truth until it became unrecognizable. And I succeeded. I won the case, and a guilty man walked free while impoverished families lost what little justice they might have claimed. He stopped pacing and looked at her directly. I broke no laws, Miss Hartley. I performed my duty with skill and dedication, but I could not live with what that duty required me to become. Josephine set down her mending, her hands suddenly unsteady. Why are you telling me this? Because I see in you someone else trapped by duty, Julian said quietly. Someone who has arranged her entire life around obligations and gratitude, who has forgotten, or perhaps never learned, what it means to live for herself. Before she could respond, the drawing-room door opened and Edmund entered, his face flushed with cold and pleasure. Excellent news! Arabella and her family have accepted my invitation to dine here next week. Mother, we must plan an evening that will do justice to the occasion. He noticed Josephine and Julian in the library, visible through the connecting door. Am I interrupting? Not at all, Julian said smoothly, his expression transforming into one of polite interest. Miss Hartley was just explaining the history of Thornfield's library. Fascinating stuff. Edmund smiled, clearly pleased. Josephine knows every book in this room. Father used to say she had read more than most university scholars. He turned to Josephine. Would you help Mother plan the menu for the dinner? Arabella mentioned she is quite particular about French cuisine. Of course. Josephine gathered her mending and left the library, but she could feel Julian's eyes following her, and his words echoed in her mind long after. The dinner party took place on a crisp November evening. Thornfield's dining room glowed with candlelight, the long mahogany table dressed in finest linens and crystal. Josephine had supervised every detail, from the flower arrangements to the placement of each piece of silver. She herself would not attend. Such gatherings were not for companions, but she watched from the shadows of the hallway as the guests arrived. Arabella Thornton was everything a future Lady Ashworth should be. Blonde and delicate, with porcelain features and a practiced smile, she moved with the assurance of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Her parents, Sir Charles and Lady Margaret, radiated satisfaction at their daughter's advantageous match. With them came Arabella's brother Thomas Thornton, a young man of perhaps 25, with the broad shoulders of a sportsman and the lazy confidence of someone who had never faced genuine hardship. What Josephine did not expect was for Thomas to notice her standing in the hallway. As the party moved toward the dining room, he paused, his eyes traveling over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl. "And who might you be?" he asked, his voice carrying the slight slur of someone who had begun drinking before arrival. "Miss Josephine Hartley, sir. Lady Catherine's companion." A companion. Thomas smiled, and there was something predatory in the expression. How charming. "And do you enjoy your position here at Thornfield, Miss Hartley?" "I am grateful for Lord Ashworth's generosity," she replied, attempting to move past him. He shifted, blocking her path. "Gratitude, that is a quality I appreciate in a woman. Tell me, Miss Hartley." "Thomas!" Arabella's sharp voice cut through the hallway. "Do cease bothering the servants and join us for dinner." Thomas laughed but moved away, leaving Josephine with her heart pounding and a sense of unease settling over her like a shroud. She retreated to the servants' quarters, but she could not shake the memory of his eyes, calculating and cruel. The dinner was proclaimed a success. Edmund and Arabella's engagement would be announced formally at Christmas, with the wedding to take place in the spring. Thornfield would have a new mistress, and Josephine would need to find a new position. Though no one said as much aloud, it was simply understood. The days grew shorter and colder. Julian remained at Thornfield, his presence a constant disturbance to Josephine's carefully maintained composure. He continued to seek her out, to engage her in conversations that challenged everything she had accepted about her life. And despite herself, despite knowing the danger of such interactions, she found herself drawn to his fierce intelligence, his refusal to accept comfortable lies. One evening, as she was returning from the village with supplies for the household, she encountered Thomas Thornton on the road. He was alone, on horseback, and the sun was setting rapidly. "Miss Hartley," he said, dismounting to block her path, "what fortune to find you here." "Mr. Thornton, I must return to Thornfield before dark." "Of course, but surely you can spare a moment." He stepped closer and she smelled brandy on his breath. "I have been thinking about you, about your position. It must be difficult, living on charity, always at the mercy of others' kindness." "I am content with my situation," Josephine said firmly, attempting to move around him. His hand shot out and gripped her arm, hard enough to bruise. "Do not presume to dismiss me, girl. You may play at being a lady, but we both know what you truly are, a servant with pretensions, wholly dependent on my future brother-in-law's goodwill." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Be kind to me, Miss Hartley, and I might ensure you keep your position after the wedding. Arabella listens to me, and she has already mentioned that she would prefer a more subservient companion." Josephine wrenched her arm free, fear and anger warring within her. "I am not for sale, Mr. Thornton. Now please let me pass." For a moment she thought he might not yield. Then he laughed, a cold sound in the gathering darkness. "We shall see, Miss Hartley. We shall see." She hurried back to Thornfield, her heart racing. The supplies clutched to her chest, but she told no one of the encounter. Who would believe her word against Thomas Thornton's? And even if they did, what could be done? Edmund was about to marry into the family. Any accusation she made would only cause discord and potentially ruin the alliance. That night she lay in her small room and faced a truth she had long avoided. Her golden cage, as comfortable as it had been, was about to transform into something far more dangerous, and she had no power, no resources, no escape route that would not leave her destitute and alone. The winter closed in around Thornfield, and with it, the trap drew tighter. December arrived with bitter cold and snow that transformed the Yorkshire moors into an alien landscape of white silence. Inside Thornfield, preparations for the Christmas season created a forced gaiety that Josephine found exhausting. Lady Catherine insisted on hosting a series of social gatherings, each more elaborate than the last, designed to display the Ashworth family's prominence and celebrate Edmund's engagement. Josephine threw herself into the work, grateful for tasks that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. But Thomas Thornton's threats haunted her quiet moments. He had begun to appear at Thornfield with increasing frequency, ostensibly to escort his sister on social calls. But Josephine noticed his eyes following her, the small, knowing smiles he directed her way when others were not watching. Julian noticed too. One afternoon, after Thomas had departed with Arabella following tea, he cornered Josephine in the conservatory where she was tending to Lady Catherine's prized orchids. "That man makes you uncomfortable," Julian said without preamble. It was not a question. Josephine's hands stilled on the watering can. "Mr. Thornton is to be Lord Ashworth's brother-in-law. My comfort is irrelevant. Has he threatened you?" She turned to face him, startled by the directness of the question and the anger evident in his expression. "Why would you think such a thing?" "Because I am trained to read people, Miss Hartley. I spent years in courtrooms watching witnesses lie, observing the small signs of fear and coercion, and I see those signs in you whenever Thomas Thornton enters a room." Julian moved closer, his voice gentle despite the intensity of his words. "If he has done something inappropriate, Edmund must be told." "And what would Lord Ashworth do?" Josephine asked, hearing the bitterness creep into her own voice. "Break his engagement and ruin the alliance between the families? Accuse his future brother-in-law based on the word of a paid companion?" She shook her head. "I am not naive, Mr. Ashworth. I understand how power operates in this world. Thomas Thornton can do as he pleases because men of his station always can. That is not justice." "No," she agreed quietly, "but it is reality." Julian looked as though he wanted to argue further, But footsteps in the hallway signaled Lady Catherine's approach, and the moment passed. Yet something had shifted between them, an unspoken understanding that created both comfort and danger. The centerpiece of the Christmas festivities was to be a grand ball on Christmas Eve, with guests arriving from across the county. It would serve as the official announcement of Edmund and Arabella's engagement, with the wedding planned for the following April. The household staff worked day and night to prepare, and Josephine found herself managing details that would have overwhelmed a less organized mind. Seating arrangements, menu selections, floral decorations, musical entertainment, and the 1,000 small details that determined whether such an event would be remembered as a triumph or a disaster. 3 days before the ball, a package arrived from London addressed to Josephine. She received it with confusion, as she maintained no correspondence with anyone in the city. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a dress of deep emerald silk, more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. The cut was modest but elegant, clearly made by a skilled dressmaker, and the color would perfectly complement her dark hair and grey eyes. A note accompanied it, written in Julian's distinctive hand. Even Cinderella attended the ball. J.A. Josephine's hands trembled as she held the dress. The implications were dangerous. Accepting such a gift was inappropriate, possibly even scandalous. Yet the gesture touched something deep within her, a recognition of her invisible labor, an acknowledgement that she deserved to be seen. She knew she should return it. Instead, she hung it carefully in her wardrobe and said nothing. The day before the ball, Thomas Thornton arrived at Thornfield alone, claiming he needed to discuss wedding arrangements with Edmund. But Edmund was away in the village, and Thomas knew it. Josephine was in the estate office, reviewing accounts, when he entered without knocking. "Miss Hartley, how convenient to find you alone." She stood immediately, gathering papers with forced calm. "Mr. Thornton, Lord Ashworth is not presently available. I can have a servant. I did not come to see Edmund." Thomas closed the door behind him, and Josephine's stomach dropped. "I came to continue our previous conversation, the one you so rudely interrupted. I have nothing to discuss with you." She moved toward the door, but he blocked her path, his larger frame imposing in the small room. "You misunderstand your situation," Thomas said, his voice pleasant despite the threat implicit in his words. "After the wedding, Arabella will be mistress here. She has already decided that Lady Catherine's companion should be someone more agreeable, more aware of the proper order of things." He reached out and fingered a lock of her hair that had escaped its pins. "But I could persuade her otherwise. I have considerable influence over my sister." Josephine jerked away from his touch. "What do you want?" "Merely your cooperation, your friendliness, small favors when I ask them." His smile was reptilian. "Nothing too demanding, surely, for someone so dependent on the family's goodwill." "You are asking me to compromise myself in exchange for keeping my position." The words came out steady, despite the fear coursing through her veins. "I am offering you a practical arrangement. You are intelligent enough to see the wisdom in it. I see only coercion and abuse of power." Josephine straightened her spine, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I will not be party to your schemes, Mr. Thornton, and I suggest you leave this room before I summon the household." For a moment, genuine anger flashed across Thomas's face, transforming his handsome features into something ugly. Then he laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "You will regret this, Miss Hartley, I promise you that." He left, and Josephine sank into a chair, her entire body shaking. She had made an enemy, one with the power and inclination to destroy her. But she could not, would not surrender to his demands. Some principles, she discovered, were worth even the terror of an uncertain future. That evening, unable to bear the weight of her fears alone, she found Julian in the library. He was reading by firelight, a glass of brandy at his elbow, and he looked up with immediate concern when she entered. "Miss Hartley, it is quite late." "I need to tell someone," she said quietly, closing the door. "And you are the only person who might understand." She told him everything, Thomas's initial approach on the road, his threats, the encounter that afternoon. Julian listened without interruption, but she watched his hands grip the book he held with increasing force until she feared he might tear the pages. "This cannot stand," he said when she finished. "Edmund must be informed immediately." "No." Josephine moved to the fire, seeking its warmth against the sudden chill that seemed to have settled into her bones. "Think, Mr. Ashworth. What proof do I have? Only my word against his. And what motivation might I appear to have? Jealousy of Miss Thornton, perhaps, a scorned woman inventing tales to disrupt an advantageous marriage. At best, I would be dismissed as delusional, at worst, as a manipulative liar seeking to damage reputations. Edmund knows your character. He would believe you, perhaps. But then what? He confronts Thomas, who denies everything. The engagement is threatened. The families are set at odds. And I become the cause of all this discord, the ungrateful companion who repaid kindness with chaos." She turned to face him. "I would lose my position, my reputation, any hope of future employment. And Thomas would continue unpunished, because men like him always do." Julian set down his book and stood, moving to stand before her. "Then what will you do?" "I will attend the ball tomorrow night," Josephine said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I will wear the beautiful dress you sent, for which I thank you, even knowing I should not. I will watch Edmund and Miss Thornton announce their engagement, and then I will begin seeking a new position, somewhere far from here, before Thomas can fulfill his threats. That is surrender. That is survival." She met his eyes, seeing in them a reflection of her own helplessness. "Not everything can be fixed, Mr. Ashworth. Not every wrong can be righted. Sometimes we simply endure and hope for better circumstances." "I despise that truth," Julian said fiercely. "I despise living in a world where power matters more than justice, where people like Thomas Thornton can threaten and harm with impunity simply because of birth and wealth. Then we are aligned in our despair." She attempted a smile. "But I thank you for listening. And for the dress. It is beautiful. You will be beautiful in it." The words were simple, honest, and something passed between them in that moment: recognition, connection, possibility. Then Julian stepped back, the barriers of propriety and circumstance reasserting themselves. "I wish I could offer you more than useless sympathy. You have offered me more than you know. You see me, Mr. Ashworth, in a world where I am largely invisible. That matters." Duch. The Christmas Eve ball arrived with frost glittering on the windows and carriages streaming up the drive throughout the afternoon. The great hall of Thornfield had been transformed into a glittering spectacle, with candles blazing in every sconce, greenery draped along the banisters, and the chandeliers polished until they cast rainbow reflections across the polished floors. Josephine spent the day in her usual role, ensuring every detail met Lady Catherine's exacting standards, troubleshooting minor crises, and remaining blessedly occupied. But as evening approached and she retreated to her small room to dress, her hands trembled as she fastened the emerald silk around her shoulders. The woman who looked back at her from the mirror was unfamiliar. The dress transformed her, highlighting features usually obscured by severe styling and somber colors. She had always considered herself plain, unremarkable. But tonight, with her dark hair styled in soft curls and the rich emerald silk bringing color to her cheeks, she looked almost beautiful. "Who are you trying to become?" she whispered to her reflection. But the woman in the mirror had no answer. The ball was already underway when she descended the servants' stairs and slipped into the great hall through a side entrance. Lady Catherine, spotting her immediately, frowned with confusion that quickly transformed into something else: surprise, perhaps even approval. "Miss Hartley, I had not realized you intended to attend." "I hope I have not overstepped," Josephine said quietly. "I thought, as this is Lord Ashworth's engagement celebration, I might observe for a short while." "Of course, child. You are practically family." Lady Catherine's expression softened. "That is a lovely dress." Edmund found her moments later, making his way through the crowd with obvious delight. "Josephine, you came!" He took her hands, his genuine pleasure evident. "You look wonderful. I'm so glad you decided to join us properly, rather than hiding away as you usually do. I did not wish to intrude." "Intrude? You have made this entire evening possible. If anyone deserves to enjoy it, you do." He squeezed her hands. "Promise me you will dance. It is a ball, after all." Before she could respond, Julian appeared at Edmund's shoulder. His eyes met hers, and something electric passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words. "Miss Hartley," he said formally, though his voice carried warmth meant only for her. "You honor us with your presence. Might I have the next dance?" It was improper, perhaps, but no one seemed inclined to object. Edmund laughed and gave them his blessing, already being drawn away by other guests demanding his attention. Julian offered his arm, and Josephine took it, allowing herself this one moment of something that felt dangerously like happiness. They danced a waltz, and Josephine discovered that Julian moved with the same fluid grace he brought to everything. For those few minutes spinning through the candlelit hall, she could almost forget the precariousness of her situation, the threats waiting in the shadows. "Thank you," she said quietly, as the music swelled around them. "For what?" "For seeing me as more than a servant, for treating me as someone worthy of consideration." "You are worthy of far more than consideration, Josephine." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the intimacy of it made her breath catch. "You are worthy of respect, protection, and a life chosen rather than endured." The music ended, and reality reasserted itself. Across the room, Josephine saw Thomas Thornton watching them, his expression dark with an emotion she could not name, but instinctively feared. Beside him, Arabella clung to Edmund's arm, radiant in white silk and diamonds, every inch the future Lady Ashworth. The announcement came at midnight. Edmund stood at the top of the grand staircase, Arabella beside him, and declared his intention to marry her that spring. The assembled guests applauded, champagne flowed, and the orchestra struck up a celebratory tune. Josephine stood at the edge of the crowd and watched the man who had been her friend, her protector, her entire world for so many years, pledge himself to a woman he barely knew. And she understood with crystalline clarity that her time at Thornfield was ending, that the golden cage was about to slam shut with her trapped inside. She turned to leave, to retreat to her room and the safety of solitude. But Thomas Thornton blocked her path, appearing so suddenly she nearly collided with him. "Leaving so soon, Miss Hartley. The evening is just beginning." His breath carried the sharp scent of too much champagne, and his eyes held a glitter that made her pulse quicken with alarm. "Or perhaps you have other plans. Secret assignations in the library, perhaps. I saw you dancing with Julian. How cozy." "Excuse me, Mr. Thornton. I'm tired." His hand closed around her wrist hard enough to hurt. "You insulted me. You rejected my generous offer. Do you truly believe there will be no consequences?" "Release her." Julian's voice cut through the noise of the celebration, cold and commanding. He stood behind Thomas, his posture relaxed but his eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. "Now." Thomas laughed, but let go, stepping back with exaggerated courtesy. "My apologies. I fear I may have had too much champagne." "I meant no offense." "Of course not," Julian said, though his tone suggested he believed nothing of the sort. He offered Josephine his arm. "Miss Hartley, allow me to escort you to a quieter location. The crowd seems to be growing overwhelming." She accepted gratefully, allowing him to guide her from the great hall toward the conservatory, where the sounds of celebration faded to a distant murmur. Her wrist throbbed where Thomas had gripped it, and she could feel the tremors beginning, the shock of the encounter finally registering. "He will not stop," she said quietly, staring at the moonlight filtering through the glass walls of the conservatory. "Men like Thomas never do. He will find a way to hurt me, to punish me for defying him. Then we must find a way to protect you," Julian said firmly. "There has to be something." The crash of glass interrupted him, followed by shouts of alarm from the direction of Lady Catherine's private sitting room. Julian and Josephine exchanged glances before racing toward the commotion. They found Edmund and several guests standing in the doorway of the sitting room, staring at chaos within. Lady Catherine's escritoire had been forced open, papers scattered everywhere, and the small wall safe where she kept family jewellery and documents stood open and empty. "Robbery!" someone said, shock evident in their voice. "Someone has robbed Lady Ashworth during the ball." The remainder of the evening dissolved into confusion. The magistrate was summoned from the village. Guests were questioned. The household staff was assembled and interrogated. But the thief had vanished into the winter night, taking with them Lady Catherine's diamond necklace, a family heirloom worth a considerable fortune, and several important documents. Josephine assisted with managing the chaos, answering questions about household procedures, comforting Lady Catherine, who was in hysterics at the violation. It was nearly dawn before she finally retreated to her room, exhausted beyond measure. She had just removed her beautiful emerald dress when her door burst open. Thomas Thornton stood there, his face flushed, his cravat loosened but his eyes sharp with purpose. "What are you doing in this part of the house?" Josephine demanded, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. "These are the servants' quarters." "I know what you did," Thomas said quietly, closing the door behind him. "I saw you leaving Lady Catherine's sitting room earlier in the evening, before the robbery was discovered. I was checking on the arrangements for dinner. Multiple servants can verify." "Can they? In all that chaos and confusion?" Thomas smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression Josephine had ever seen. "Here is what is going to happen, Miss Hartley. Tomorrow morning, I am going to tell the magistrate that I witnessed you acting suspiciously near the sitting room. I will suggest they search your quarters. And imagine what they might find hidden here. Perhaps a diamond necklace, perhaps documents that could be sold for considerable sums." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face as understanding crashed over her. "You are going to frame me for the robbery. I am going to ensure you understand the price of defying me." Thomas moved closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Unless, of course, we can come to an understanding. You provide me with the cooperation I have requested, and I will forget what I saw this evening. Your reputation remains intact, your position secure." "You are despicable." The words emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I am practical, and you have until morning to decide." He turned toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Miss Hartley, even if you go to Edmund now, who will he believe? His future brother-in-law or a dependent companion with no family and no prospects? Make the wise choice." He left, and Josephine sank onto her narrow bed, her mind racing. Thomas had outmaneuvered her completely. If he planted evidence in her room, she would be arrested, tried, possibly transported, or imprisoned. Her word meant nothing against his accusations. But agreeing to his demands meant a different kind of imprisonment, one that would require her to compromise everything she believed about herself. She sat in the darkness as the winter dawn crept across the sky, and she realized there was no good choice. There was only survival, and the question of what price she was willing to pay for it. The golden cage had finally become a trap, and the door was swinging shut. The magistrate arrived at Thornfield with the morning light, a stern man named Whitmore, who had overseen the county's justice for 3 decades. Josephine watched from the hallway as he conducted interviews in the library, speaking with each member of the household staff, examining the scene of the crime with methodical precision. Her hands remained steady as she served tea to Lady Catherine, who had taken to her bed with shock and distress, but internally Josephine felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for Thomas to fulfill his threat and send her tumbling into the abyss. The summons came just before noon. A maid appeared at Lady Catherine's door, her face pale. "Miss Hartley, the magistrate wishes to speak with you in the library." Josephine descended the stairs with her spine straight and her expression carefully neutral. She had decided during the sleepless night that she would not give Thomas the satisfaction of seeing her fear, regardless of what came next. Julian was standing in the hallway outside the library when she arrived, and the concern in his eyes nearly undid her composure. "Josephine, he said quietly, reaching for her hand. "Whatever happens, you must tell the truth. Edmund and I will support you." She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that justice might prevail. But she had lived long enough in a world governed by power rather than principle to know better. "Thank you," she said simply, squeezing his hand once before releasing it and entering the library. Magistrate Whitmore sat behind Edmund's desk, papers spread before him, his expression grave. Edmund stood by the window, his face drawn with worry and sleeplessness. And Thomas Thornton occupied a chair near the fireplace, the very picture of concerned cooperation. "Miss Hartley," Whitmore began, his voice formal, "thank you for joining us. I have a few questions regarding your movements yesterday evening." "Of course, sir. I'm happy to assist however I can." "Mr. Thornton has provided testimony that he observed you leaving Lady Catherine's sitting room at approximately 11:30, shortly before the robbery was discovered. Can you confirm this?" Josephine's stomach tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I did pass through that area of the house multiple times throughout the evening, sir. I was managing the arrangements for the ball and needed to ensure all details were properly executed. Can anyone verify your presence elsewhere during the crucial time period?" She thought desperately. The ball had been chaotic, with servants rushing everywhere and guests moving between rooms. "I spent considerable time in the kitchen consulting with cook, and I was assisting with the announcement preparations. But no one can definitively account for your whereabouts at the specific time in question," Thomas interjected smoothly. "I mean no disrespect, Miss Hartley, but in my observation you seemed quite distressed during the latter part of the evening, as though something was troubling you." "I was concerned about the success of the event," Josephine said, meeting his eyes directly. "It was a significant occasion for Lord Ashworth and his family." "Indeed." Whitmore made notes with precise handwriting. "Miss Hartley, I must ask, do you possess any items of significant value? Any jewelry or expensive possessions?" "No, sir. My wages are modest, and I have no family wealth to draw upon." "So, if we were to conduct a search of your quarters, we would find nothing unusual." The trap was springing closed. Josephine could feel Thomas's eyes on her, could sense his satisfaction. He had planted something in her room, she was certain of it. The moment they searched, she would be condemned. "Whitmore," Edmund interrupted, moving from the window with visible agitation. "This is absurd. Josephine has lived at Thornfield for years. She is completely trustworthy. I will not have her treated like a common criminal based on vague suspicions." "I appreciate your confidence in Miss Hartley, Lord Ashworth," the magistrate replied. "However, I must be thorough. A valuable heirloom has been stolen, and it is my duty to investigate all possibilities." "Then investigate someone else," Edmund said firmly. "Question the outside staff. Examine whether any of the ball guests had opportunity, but do not harass someone who has served this family faithfully simply because Thomas thought he saw her in a hallway." "I saw what I saw," Thomas said quietly, his tone suggesting hurt at Edmund's doubt. "I am only trying to help." The library door opened, and Julian entered without announcement, his face tense. "Whitmore, a moment, please. I have discovered something that may be relevant." The magistrate looked up with interest. "Mr. Ashworth, what have you found?" Julian held up a piece of paper, his expression carefully neutral. "I was examining the forced escritoire, and I noticed this document caught in the back of the drawer. It appears to be a receipt from a London jeweller, dated 3 weeks ago, for the repair and cleaning of a diamond necklace matching the description of the stolen item." "May I see that?" Whitmore took the paper, examining it closely. "This indicates Lady Catherine sent the necklace to London for servicing. Why would she do so shortly before a major social event?" "Perhaps you should ask her ladyship that question," Julian suggested smoothly. "It occurs to me that in her distress last night, she may have forgotten this detail." Whitmore stood, gathering his papers. "Yes, I believe I should. Lord Ashworth, Mr. Thornton, Miss Hartley, please remain available for further questioning if necessary." As the magistrate left to consult with Lady Catherine, the tension in the room crystallized. Thomas's expression had transformed from satisfaction to fury, while Edmund looked confused. Julian caught Josephine's eye and gave the smallest nod, and she understood. He had fabricated the receipt, had created a plausible alternative explanation to buy her time. "That is very convenient," Thomas said coldly, his eyes fixed on Julian. "A document conveniently discovered just when Miss Hartley's position seemed precarious." "I merely examined the scene more carefully than others had," Julian replied, his tone mild but his eyes sharp. "Surely you do not object to thoroughness in an investigation, Mr. Thornton?" Thomas stood abruptly. "I should return to the Thornton estate. Arabella will be wondering why I have been detained so long." He moved toward the door, then paused beside Josephine. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice just loud enough for her alone to hear, "this is not finished." After he left, Edmund collapsed into a chair, rubbing his eyes. "What a nightmare! I cannot believe the family heirloom was stolen during what should have been a celebration." He looked at Josephine with genuine distress. "I am sorry you were questioned so harshly. Thomas was only trying to help, but his suspicions were completely unfounded." "Of course," Josephine murmured, though her hands trembled. She clasped them together to hide the shaking. "Edmund," Julian said carefully, "might I suggest that Miss Hartley could benefit from a brief respite from Thornfield? The events of last evening were traumatic for everyone, but particularly for someone who worked so hard to make the ball a success, only to see it end in chaos. Perhaps a visit to London or to relatives." "An excellent idea." Edmund stood, already moving towards solutions, as was his nature. "Josephine, do you have family or friends who might host you for a few weeks? A change of scenery would do you good." "No, my lord. I have no family, and my acquaintances are limited to the household here." "Then you must accept my hospitality," Julian said. "My sister maintains a home in Bath. She is always delighted to receive visitors, and the city would provide excellent distraction. I could write to her today." It was an escape route, carefully disguised as a kindness. Josephine met Julian's eyes and saw the urgency there, the unspoken message: "Accept this, leave before Thomas can harm you further." "That is extraordinarily generous, Mr. Ashworth. If Lord Ashworth approves—" "Absolutely," Edmund said, relief evident in his voice. "Take as long as you need. Mother will manage with temporary assistance, and you deserve some time for yourself." Later that afternoon, as Josephine packed her meager belongings, Julian appeared at her door with news. "Whitmore has concluded his investigation. He believes the robbery was the work of an outside thief who took advantage of the ball's confusion. The receipt I discovered convinced Lady Catherine that she had indeed sent the necklace to London and forgotten about it in her distress. She is now unsure whether anything was actually stolen at all." "You fabricated that document to save me," Josephine said quietly. "You committed fraud to protect me from Thomas's scheme." "I created reasonable doubt," Julian corrected, "and I would do far worse to see justice served. Thomas's plan was transparent: frame you for theft, force you into compliance with his demands under threat of exposure. It was extortion and false witness, both crimes in their own right, but crimes that will go unpunished because he is a gentleman, and I am merely a companion." Josephine closed her traveling case with decisive force. "I am grateful for your intervention, but we both know this is only a temporary solution. Thomas will not forget or forgive, and when I return from Bath, he will be waiting." "Then perhaps you should not return," Julian said seriously. "Bath is a large city with opportunities for someone of your intelligence and education. My sister could help you establish yourself independently, find respectable employment that does not place you at the mercy of men like Thomas Thornton." "You are suggesting I abandon Thornfield, leave Lord Ashworth and Lady Catherine without explanation?" "I am suggesting you choose yourself for once in your life." Julian moved closer, his voice passionate. "Edmund will understand once the situation is explained to him. Lady Catherine will find another companion, but you will have your freedom, Josephine. You will have a chance to build a life based on choice rather than obligation. She wanted to accept, wanted to embrace the possibility he offered, but years of gratitude and duty were not so easily discarded. I need time to think, to understand what is truly possible. Then think in Bath, Julian said gently, and know that whatever you decide, you will have my support. The journey to Bath took 3 days by coach, with Julian serving as escort. They stayed in respectable inns, maintaining perfect propriety, but the hours of travel allowed for conversations that ranged from literature to philosophy, from personal history to dreams long suppressed. Josephine learned that Julian's retreat from London had been prompted not just by professional disillusionment, but by a broken engagement. The woman he had intended to marry had chosen a wealthier suitor when his crisis of conscience had affected his practice's profitability. She said I had changed, Julian told her as their coach rattled through the countryside, that I was no longer the ambitious barrister she had agreed to marry. And she was right. I had changed. I could no longer pretend that success justified any moral compromise. Do you regret losing her? No. I regret that I ever believed we were suited. He looked at her directly. True connection requires more than shared social status and compatible ambitions. It requires seeing each other clearly, understanding each other's essential nature. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. They arrived in Bath on a clear winter afternoon, the honey-coloured stone of the city's buildings glowing in the pale sunlight. Julian's sister, Mrs. Helena Carstairs, proved to be a widow of perhaps 40, elegant and kind, with her brother's intelligent eyes and none of his tortured intensity. "Miss Hartley," she said warmly, embracing Josephine without hesitation. "Julian has written of you often. I am delighted to finally make your acquaintance." "You are very kind to host me on such short notice, Mrs. Carstairs." "Nonsense. I adore having visitors, and Julian speaks so highly of you." Helena linked arms with Josephine, drawing her into the townhouse. "Now you must tell me everything. Julian mentioned you need a respite from Yorkshire, but I suspect there is a more interesting story behind your visit." Over the following weeks, Josephine discovered a different kind of life in Bath. Helena moved in circles of intelligent, accomplished women, writers, reformers, educators. She hosted salons where ideas were debated with passion, where a woman's thoughts were valued regardless of her birth or station. Julian remained in Bath as well, ostensibly to settle some legal matters, but clearly reluctant to leave while Josephine's situation remained unresolved. They walked along the Royal Crescent, visited the assembly rooms, and engaged in debates that challenged everything Josephine had accepted about her place in the world. "You could teach," Helena suggested one evening as they sat by the fire in her drawing room. "There is a school here in Bath seeking an instructor in literature and languages. Your education is more than sufficient, and the position includes lodging and a respectable salary." "I have no formal credentials," Josephine protested, though her heart quickened at the possibility. "Neither do half the women teaching at schools across England. What you have is knowledge, discipline, and the ability to inspire others. That matters far more than certificates." Helena leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Miss Hartley, Josephine, you have spent years serving others. Perhaps it is time to serve yourself." That night, alone in the comfortable guest room Helena had provided, Josephine wrote a letter to Edmund. She explained Thomas's threats, the fabricated accusations, her reasons for seeking refuge in Bath. She released him from any sense of obligation to her, thanked him for years of kindness, and asked only that he believe her account of events. She also wrote a second letter to the school Helena had mentioned, inquiring about the teaching position. Both letters sat on her escritoire for 2 days before she found the courage to send them. The response from Edmund arrived within a week, and his words broke something open in Josephine's carefully controlled heart. He believed her completely, was horrified by Thomas's behavior, and had immediately confronted his future brother-in-law with the accusations. Thomas, of course, had denied everything, claiming Josephine was a vindictive woman, angry about being displaced by Arabella's arrival. The confrontation had created a terrible rift. Arabella defended her brother absolutely, suggesting Edmund was allowing a mere servant to disrupt their engagement. Lady Catherine, when informed of the situation, had been torn between loyalty to her son and her own affection for Josephine, but ultimately sided with the necessity of the advantageous marriage. Edmund wrote that he could not break the engagement without creating a scandal that would affect his family's standing for generations. But he promised to protect Josephine from any further harassment and pledged his continued support should she choose to establish herself independently. It was, Josephine understood, the best he could offer, and it was not enough to make returning to Thornfield safe. The school responded to her inquiry with an invitation to interview, and the interview led to an offer of employment beginning after Easter. Josephine would teach literature and deportment to girls from merchant families, young women seeking education to improve their marriage prospects or prepare for independent lives. "It is decided, then," Helena said when Josephine shared the news. "You will stay in Bath, build a new life, be free of the obligations that have defined you for so long." "I feel as though I'm abandoning Lord Ashworth when he needs support most," Josephine admitted. "The situation with his engagement has become strained because of my accusations against Thomas. Edmund is a grown man capable of managing his own affairs," Julian said firmly. He had been present when Josephine shared her decision, and his relief had been visible. "You are not responsible for fixing the consequences of Thomas Thornton's villainy. You are only responsible for your own life and happiness." Spring arrived early in Bath that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. Josephine began her teaching position and discovered a talent for inspiring young minds, for opening worlds of literature and thought to girls who had been taught to expect little beyond domestic accomplishment. Julian remained in Bath as well, quietly establishing a modest legal practice focused on defending those without means rather than representing the wealthy. They saw each other often, their friendship deepening into something neither dared name, but both recognized. On an April afternoon, as cherry blossoms drifted through the air and the city hummed with life, Julian found Josephine in the gardens behind Helena's townhouse. She was reading, her dark hair catching the sunlight, and she looked more at peace than he had ever seen her. "I received a letter from Edmund," he said, settling onto the bench beside her. "The wedding is tomorrow. He writes that the entire affair has become a social obligation rather than a celebration, but he is committed to seeing it through. Poor Edmund. He deserves better than a marriage built on duty and discord. We all deserve better than that." Julian hesitated, then reached for her hand. "Josephine, I must speak plainly. These months in Bath, watching you blossom into the life you were meant to lead, have convinced me of something I have suspected since we first met. You are extraordinary, intelligent, courageous, principled, and I have fallen quite desperately in love with you." Josephine's breath caught. "Julian, I know this is sudden. I know you have just escaped one complicated situation and may not wish to enter another, but I cannot let you continue without knowing how I feel, without offering you the choice of building a life together, if you wish it." His grip on her hand tightened. "I have nothing grand to offer, no estate, no title, just a modest practice, a commitment to living according to principle, and a heart that is entirely yours, if you will have it." She looked at their joined hands, at this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had risked his own integrity to protect her, who offered not rescue, but partnership. "I am not what society considers a suitable match for you. Society's considerations are precisely what I left behind in London." Julian raised her hand to his lips. "You are everything that matters. The question is whether you could imagine a future with someone as flawed and foolish as I am." "There is nothing foolish about you," Josephine said, and she was smiling, feeling hope and joy unfurl in her chest like flowers in spring. And yes, Julian, yes, I can imagine that future. I want that future. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Josephine understood that she had finally found what she had been seeking without knowing she searched. Not rescue, not security, but recognition. Someone who saw her fully and loved, not despite who she was, but because of it. The future stretched before her, uncertain but filled with possibility, and for the first time in her life, Josephine Hartley felt truly free. The morning of Edmund's wedding dawned grey and cold across Yorkshire, a sharp contrast to the warmth of Bath. Josephine had not intended to return for the ceremony, had convinced herself that her presence would only complicate an already strained situation. But a letter from Lady Catherine had arrived 3 days prior, written in the old woman's shaking hand, begging Josephine to attend. "I know there has been unpleasantness," Lady Catherine had written, "but you are as close to family as Edmund has beyond myself. Your absence would be a wound he is too noble to acknowledge, but would feel keenly. Please, child, come home for this one day." So Josephine and Julian had made the journey north, arriving at Thornfield the evening before the wedding. Edmund had embraced Josephine with visible relief, though the strain in his face was evident. The month since Christmas had aged him, carving lines of tension around his eyes and mouth. "I am glad you came," he said quietly, away from the other guests filling the manor. "Even if this wedding has become more obligation than celebration, having you here makes it feel less like a prison sentence. Edmund, if you truly believe this marriage is a mistake, it is too late for doubts," he interrupted gently. "The contracts are signed, the alliance secured. And Arabella is not a terrible person, merely limited in her understanding. Perhaps in time we will find contentment, if not passion." It was, Josephine thought sadly, the most Edmund could hope for. Contentment. The settling of a man who had chosen duty over every other consideration. The wedding was to take place at St. Margaret's Church, the same ancient building where generations of Ashworths had celebrated marriages, christenings and funerals. Guests began arriving at mid-morning, their carriages creating a procession through the village. The church filled with the county's prominent families, all dressed in their finest, all maintaining the elaborate social theatre that governed their world. Josephine sat in a pew near the back, Julian beside her, both of them occupying the ambiguous space of guests who did not quite belong to the bride's party or the groom's inner circle. From her vantage point, she could observe the assembled crowd, the satisfied Thorntons in the front rows, Lady Catherine looking frail but determined, and Edmund standing at the altar with the rigid posture of a man facing execution rather than matrimony. Thomas Thornton stood as groomsman, his position secured by the alliance between families, despite the unspoken tensions. He looked prosperous and pleased with himself, a man whose schemes had largely succeeded. When his eyes found Josephine in the crowd, his smile sharpened with malice, and she was reminded that he had not forgiven or forgotten her defiance. The ceremony began with the traditional processional. Arabella entered on her father's arm, a vision in white lace and silk, her blonde hair crowned with orange blossoms. She looked beautiful and appropriately solemn, playing her role with the precision of someone who had been trained for this moment since birth. The vicar began the service, his words echoing through the stone sanctuary with practiced solemnity. Edmund and Arabella stood before him, and Josephine watched her friend pledge himself to a future he had not chosen but could not escape. "If any person can show just cause why these two may not lawfully be joined together," the vicar intoned, "let them now speak, or else hereafter forever hold their peace." The traditional pause followed, a mere formality. No one ever actually objected at weddings. Such disruptions happened only in Gothic novels, not in the carefully ordered world of the English gentry. Then the church doors burst open with a crash that reverberated through the sanctuary like a thunderclap. Every head turned to see two magistrates entering, Whitmore among them, followed by several constables. The lead magistrate, a man Josephine did not recognize, moved down the aisle with grim authority. "This ceremony cannot proceed," he announced, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "I am Magistrate Pemberton from York, and I have a warrant for the arrest of Thomas Thornton on charges of theft and fraud." The congregation erupted in chaos. Arabella shrieked. Sir Charles Thornton leaped to his feet, shouting protests. Thomas himself had gone white, his eyes darting toward the exits where constables now stood guard. "This is outrageous," Sir Charles roared. "On what evidence do you make such an accusation against my son?" "On the evidence of a fence arrested in York last week," Pemberton replied coldly, "who provided testimony regarding stolen goods he purchased from Mr. Thornton over the past 6 months. Among those goods was a diamond necklace matching the description of the item stolen from Lady Catherine Ashworth on Christmas Eve." Lady Catherine gasped audibly. Edmund turned from the altar, his face a mask of shock and growing anger. And Josephine felt Julian's hand find hers, squeezing once in silent communication. "Thomas?" Arabella's voice was small, confused. "Tell them they are mistaken." But Thomas said nothing, his silence more damning than any confession. "Furthermore," Pemberton continued, producing papers from his coat, "we have evidence that Mr. Thornton has been systematically stealing from his own family's estate for over 2 years, selling off valuables and pocketing the proceeds. The theft at Thornfield was merely one incident in a pattern of criminal behavior." "You cannot prove any of this," Thomas said finally, finding his voice, though it emerged, strained and desperate. "The testimony of a common criminal means nothing against my word." "We have more than testimony," Whitmore interjected, stepping forward. "After the incident on Christmas Eve, I took it upon myself to investigate more thoroughly. The fabricated receipt that mysteriously appeared was the first clue. Someone had gone to great lengths to divert suspicion. When I learned Mr. Thornton had accused Miss Hartley of suspicious behavior, I began to wonder why he was so eager to deflect attention." Josephine's heart began to pound as she understood where this revelation was heading. "I discovered that Mr. Thornton had debts," Whitmore continued. "Gambling debts primarily owed to some very dangerous individuals in London. He needed money urgently, and he needed it to remain secret from his family. So he began stealing, small items at first, things that might not be missed immediately. But the debts grew larger, his desperation increased, and eventually he became reckless." "This is absurd," Sir Charles said, but his voice had lost its certainty. He was looking at his son with dawning horror. "Father, I can explain," Thomas began, but Pemberton cut him off. "You can explain to a magistrate and jury, Mr. Thornton. Constables, take him into custody." As the constables moved to arrest Thomas, he suddenly lunged not toward the exit, but toward Arabella, grabbing his sister and pulling her back against him. In his hand, appeared from somewhere in his coat, was a small pistol. "Stay back," Thomas commanded, his voice cracking with panic. "I will not hang for this. I will not let you destroy me." The congregation scattered, women screaming, men shouting. Edmund moved to approach, but the pistol swung toward him and he froze. "Thomas, please," Arabella sobbed, terrified tears streaming down her face. "Let me go." "You never understood," Thomas said, his words spilling out in desperate rush. The pressure, the expectations, father's constant disappointment, the need to maintain appearances while the money ran out. "I did what I had to do to survive." "You stole from your own family," Edmund said, his voice hard with fury and betrayal. "You committed crimes and then attempted to frame an innocent woman for your sins. That is not survival, Thomas. That is cowardice." "What do you know of it?" Thomas shouted. "You with your grand estate and your effortless honor. Everything comes easily to you, Ashworth. Some of us have to fight for every scrap." "I know about difficult choices," a new voice said, and Josephine found herself speaking without conscious decision, rising from her pew and moving slowly down the aisle. "I know what it means to be powerless, to depend on others' goodwill, to fear for your future. But I never became cruel, Thomas. I never used my circumstances as justification for harming others." "Stay back, Miss Hartley," Pemberton warned, but Josephine continued her approach. her eyes fixed on Thomas's face. "You threatened me," she continued, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "You attempted to coerce me into compromising myself. And when I refused, you tried to destroy me by framing me for your crime, all because I would not submit to your will. You humiliated me," Thomas said, but the pistol had lowered slightly. "You rejected me as though you were better than me, you with your charity position and your borrowed dresses. I rejected cruelty and manipulation. I chose dignity over survival purchased at the cost of my soul." Josephine took another step closer. "And that choice was possible only because people helped me, Mr. Julian Ashworth, who created reasonable doubt when you tried to have me arrested, Mrs. Carstairs, who offered me sanctuary, Lord Ashworth, who believed my accusations despite the cost to his alliance with your family. I survived not through schemes and theft, but through the kindness of people who saw me as worthy of protection." "How touching," Thomas sneered, but his grip on Arabella had loosened. "Let your sister go," Josephine said quietly. "She has done nothing to deserve your using her as a shield. Whatever happens to you now, do this one honorable thing." For a long moment, Thomas stood frozen, the pistol trembling in his hand. Then, with a sound that might have been a sob, he released Arabella, who stumbled forward into her father's arms. The pistol clattered to the stone floor, and Thomas sank to his knees as constables surrounded him. "I confess," he said, the words emerging flat and broken. "I stole the necklace. I stole from my father's estate. I attempted to frame Miss Hartley. I did it all." As the constables led Thomas from the church in chains, Josephine felt Julian's arm around her shoulders, supporting her as the adrenaline drained away, and she began to shake. Edmund appeared before her, his face a complicated mix of emotions. "You were magnificent," he said quietly, "and I am sorrier than I can express that you were ever placed in danger because of my family's association with the Thorntons. You could not have known his true nature," Josephine replied. "None of us could, but I should have believed you more quickly when you reported his threats." Edmund took her hands in his. "I should have protected you better. Can you forgive me?" "There is nothing to forgive. You did the best you could with impossible circumstances." The wedding naturally could not proceed. Arabella was in hysterics, Sir Charles was demanding his lawyers, and Lady Catherine had been helped from the church by her servants, overcome by the scandal. The assembled guests dispersed in a chaos of gossip and speculation, already composing the letters they would write to friends and relatives describing the extraordinary events. Julian guided Josephine out of the church and into the cold April air, where she took deep, steadying breaths. "That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish," he said, holding her close. "You could have been hurt. I could not let him use his sister as a shield. Whatever else Arabella is, she did not deserve to be terrorized by her brother's desperation. Your capacity for compassion never ceases to amaze me," Julian murmured against her hair, "even for those who have not been kind to you." They returned to Thornfield, where a strange calm had descended over the household. The wedding feast prepared would go uneaten. The decorations would be taken down. The alliance between the families was shattered beyond repair. But underneath the chaos was a sense of relief, as though a poison had been lanced and could finally begin to heal. That evening, Edmund found Josephine and Julian in the library, where they had retreated to escape the ongoing drama. He carried a bottle of his finest brandy and 3 glasses. "To truth," he said, pouring generous measures for each of them, "however painful its revelation." They drank, and Edmund settled into a chair with a long exhale. "I find myself unexpectedly free," he said. "No longer engaged, no longer bound by an alliance that was corrupt from its foundation. It is terrifying and liberating in equal measure." "What will you do?" Josephine asked. "I have no idea," Edmund admitted with a laugh that held genuine amusement. "For the first time in my life, my future is not predetermined. I'm 35 years old, and I have never made a truly independent choice. Perhaps it is time I learned how." "I recommend it highly," Julian said, "though I warn you, Living according to your own principles rather than society's expectations is far more difficult than it appears. Yet you both seem remarkably content, Edmund observed, looking between them with a knowing smile. I am not blind, you know. I have seen how you look at each other, the way you move as though connected by invisible threads. I assume congratulations will soon be in order. Josephine felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Julian simply smiled. We have an understanding, yes, though we have not yet formalized our engagement out of respect for the turmoil surrounding your own situation. Do not delay on my account, Edmund said warmly. Happiness should be celebrated, not postponed. And I can think of no two people more deserving of it. They talked long into the night, three people who had been shaped by obligation and expectation, finally beginning to understand what it meant to choose rather than simply accept. Outside, the Yorkshire wind howled across the moors, but inside Thornfield's library, something new was being born. A future written by their own hands rather than dictated by circumstance and duty. The scandal of Thomas Thornton's arrest and the dramatic collapse of Edmund's wedding became the talk of the county for months. Letters flew between great houses, rumours proliferated, and society divided itself into camps of sympathy and condemnation. But at Thornfield, an unexpected peace settled over the estate. Sir Charles Thornton, devastated by his son's crimes and desperate to salvage what remained of the family's reputation, quietly arranged for Thomas to be transported to Australia rather than face a public trial. It was a solution that satisfied no one's sense of justice but prevented further spectacle. Thomas departed England in chains, his future now one of hard labour in a distant colony, and the Thornton family retreated from society, their name permanently tarnished. Arabella, to everyone's surprise, proved more resilient than anyone had credited. Freed from her brother's influence and the pressure to make an advantageous match, she chose to remain unmarried and eventually established herself as a patroness of charitable works in York. She and Edmund maintained a distant but cordial relationship, united by their shared escape from a marriage that would have made them both miserable. Edmund himself underwent a transformation that fascinated and confused his peers. He began to question the assumptions that had governed his life, to examine whether duty and tradition always served the best interests of those they were meant to protect. He reduced rents for his tenant farmers, invested in improvements to their cottages, and began to educate himself on the reform movements sweeping through England. I spent 35 years being the person others expected me to be, he told Josephine during one of her visits from Bath. It is both terrifying and exhilarating to discover who I actually am when those expectations are removed. Lady Catherine, initially horrified by the scandal and her son's increasingly progressive views, gradually came to accept the new order. Josephine's vindication had restored the old woman's affection, and she wrote frequent letters to Bath, expressing pride in Josephine's teaching career and subtle suggestions that perhaps she missed having such a capable companion. But Josephine's life had moved beyond the confines of Thornfield. Her position at the school in Bath had evolved from temporary employment to permanent appointment, and she had established herself as an inspiring educator whose students genuinely thrived under her guidance. She taught not just literature and deportment, but critical thinking and the dangerous notion that young women might shape their own destinies. Julian's legal practice flourished as well, though not in the traditional sense of wealth and prestige. He became known as the barrister who would take cases others avoided, defending the poor, challenging exploitative contracts, representing those without resources or influence. He earned little money, but considerable respect among those who valued justice over profit. Their courtship had continued through the spring and summer, conducted with propriety but deepening intimacy. They walked along the River Avon, attended concerts at the assembly rooms, and engaged in debates that ranged from law to literature to the fundamental questions of how society should be organized. Julian's sister Helena served as chaperone and cheerful conspirator, clearly delighted by their growing attachment. On a golden evening in late August, Julian invited Josephine to dinner at his modest townhouse. Helena was conveniently called away to attend a friend, leaving them alone in his book-lined study with the remains of their meal and a bottle of excellent wine. "I have been thinking," Julian began, settling beside her on the sofa with an air of studied casualness that immediately alerted Josephine to the significance of whatever he was about to say, about futures and choices and the courage required to build something new rather than simply accepting what exists. "That is rather philosophical for after-dinner conversation," Josephine said, smiling. "I'm avoiding the actual subject because I am, despite my courtroom experience, surprisingly nervous." He took her hand, his thumb tracing patterns across her knuckles. "Josephine Hartley, I love you. I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing in Thornfield's library, invisible to everyone, but managing everything, brilliant and underestimated and utterly remarkable." "Julian, let me finish before I lose courage," he interrupted gently. "I have nothing grand to offer you. No estate, no title, no guarantee of wealth or security. What I can offer is partnership, a life built on shared principles and genuine respect. A future where your voice matters as much as mine, where your ambitions are given equal weight, where we face the world together as allies rather than one subordinate to the other." He released her hand to retrieve a small box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, not an ostentatious diamond, but a beautiful sapphire surrounded by small pearls, elegant and thoughtful. "This was my grandmother's," Julian explained. "She was, by all accounts, a woman ahead of her time, intelligent, outspoken, and completely unwilling to accept limitations based on her sex. My grandfather loved her madly precisely because she challenged him. I like to think they would both approve of you." Tears pricked Josephine's eyes. "It is beautiful. The question, of course, is whether you will wear it, whether you will consent to marry me and build this uncertain but hopeful future together." Julian's blue eyes were vulnerable, open in a way she had rarely seen. "I would understand if you chose otherwise. You have only just gained your independence, discovered what it means to live for yourself. I would not want you to feel you were simply trading one obligation for another." "Is that truly what you think marriage to you would be?" Josephine asked. "An obligation? I hope not. But I know enough of the world to understand that legal marriage gives husbands considerable power over wives. I cannot promise I will always use that power wisely, though I can promise I will try. The law may treat you as subordinate, but I will not." Josephine took the ring from the box, examining it in the candlelight. The sapphire caught the flame and transformed it into blue fire. "You are overthinking this, Julian Ashworth. The answer is yes. Yes." He looked almost comically surprised, as though he had genuinely expected rejection. "Yes, I will marry you. Yes, I want to build this uncertain future together. Yes, I trust you to be the partner you promised to be." She held out her left hand. "Now put the ring on before I change my mind." He laughed, a sound of pure joy, and slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he kissed her with passion that had been carefully restrained through months of proper courtship, and Josephine kissed him back, feeling desire and excitement and the deep security of being truly seen and valued. "When?" Julian asked when they finally broke apart, both of them breathless and grinning foolishly. "Soon," Josephine replied. "I see no reason to wait. We are both of age, independent, and absurdly certain of our feelings. Let us not waste time with long engagements and elaborate preparations." "My practical love," Julian murmured against her temple, always cutting through to the essential truth. They married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at Bath Abbey, with only close friends present. Helena served as witness, radiant with satisfaction at her matchmaking success. Edmund travelled from Yorkshire to stand with Julian, his presence a blessing on the union and a symbol of his own transformation. Lady Catherine sent a generous gift, and a letter expressing approval mixed with the faint suggestion that Josephine could have done better than a barrister with no estate. Josephine wore a dress of ivory silk, simple but beautiful, her dark hair crowned with autumn roses. She carried no illusions of fairy tale romance, understood that marriage would bring challenges alongside joys. But as she exchanged vows with Julian, promising partnership and mutual respect rather than obedience and subordination, she felt a completeness she had never expected to experience. Their wedding breakfast was held at Helena's townhouse, an intimate gathering filled with laughter and genuine warmth. Edmund gave a toast that referenced their shared history at Thornfield, the unexpected paths that had brought them all to this moment. "To Josephine and Julian," he said, raising his glass, "two people who refused to accept the limitations others placed upon them and created something new in the process. May we all have the courage to do the same." They honeymooned in the Lake District, spending 2 weeks in a cottage overlooking Windermere. It was there, surrounded by the stark beauty of mountains and water, that Josephine and Julian truly began their married life, learning each other's rhythms, discovering the small intimacies of sharing space and futures, talking long into the nights about the life they would build together. "I want to open a firm that specializes in cases involving women's rights," Julian said one evening as they sat before the cottage fire. "Property disputes, custody battles, employment discrimination. There is so much injustice baked into the law itself, but there are also arguments to be made, precedents to be set, incremental changes to be won." "That sounds both noble and frustrating," Josephine replied, her head resting on his shoulder. "Probably, but worthwhile work usually is." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "What about you? Are you content with teaching, or do you have other ambitions?" Josephine considered the question seriously. "I love teaching, but I think there is more I could do. Perhaps writing, publishing articles about education reform, contributing to the conversations about women's place in society. I want to use my voice, Julian. For so long I was silent, because silence was survival. Now I want to speak." "Then speak," he said simply. "I will support whatever you choose to pursue." They returned to Bath in October, moving into a townhouse Julian had purchased, modest but comfortable, with a study where they could both work, and a small garden where Josephine planned to cultivate roses. She resumed her teaching position, but she also began writing essays that examined women's education from both philosophical and practical perspectives. Her first published article appeared in a reform journal that winter, arguing that educating women benefited society as a whole by creating more capable mothers, more informed citizens, and more productive contributors to the economy. It was hardly radical by the standards of the most progressive reformers, but it represented Josephine's entrance into public discourse, her claiming of a voice that could reach beyond the classroom. Julian's practice evolved as he had hoped, taking on cases that challenged the legal limitations placed on women. He won some, lost others, but each case established precedents and arguments that future attorneys could build upon. Together, they became known in Bath's reform circles as a couple genuinely committed to creating social change. They also maintained their connections to Thornfield. Edmund visited frequently, and his transformation continued. He became involved with parliamentary reformers, using his seat in the House of Lords to advocate for tenant protections and workers' rights. Lady Catherine adjusted to her son's new direction with surprising grace, perhaps recognizing that Edmund's happiness mattered more than her adherence to tradition. On a cold January afternoon, 2 years after their wedding, Josephine received a letter that made her laugh with delight and pass it immediately to Julian. "Edmund is engaged," she announced, "to a Miss Charlotte Brennan, daughter of an Irish landowner. He writes that she is intelligent, outspoken, passionate about land reform, and completely uninterested in his title. He seems besotted." "Good for him," Julian said warmly. "Everyone deserves a chance at genuine connection. He wants us to attend the wedding in the spring, at Thornfield, naturally. He says he hopes we can withstand the scandal of being associated with 2 failed engagements and 1 successful criminal prosecution. I think we can manage, Julian replied, pulling her onto his lap, though I make no promises about the gossip we will generate by being obviously, scandalously happy with each other. The winter passed with work and companionship, quiet evenings by the fire, and passionate debates about the future of society. Josephine discovered she was pregnant in March, news that filled both her and Julian with joy, mixed with trepidation. They would be parents, would shape another life with their values and hopes. What kind of world are we bringing a child into? Josephine wondered aloud one evening, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. An imperfect one, Julian acknowledged, but perhaps one we are helping to improve, even if only incrementally. And we will teach them, him or her, to question assumptions, to value justice over comfort, to choose courage over compliance. That sounds appropriately ambitious and probably exhausting, Josephine said with a smile. All worthwhile endeavors are. They travelled to Thornfield in April for Edmund's wedding, and the contrast to that disastrous Christmas Eve ball could not have been more stark. This ceremony was smaller, more intimate, filled with people Edmund genuinely cared for rather than social obligations. Charlotte Brennan proved to be exactly as advertised, sharp-witted, passionately committed to reform, and completely unfazed by the Ashworth family's complicated recent history. "So you are the famous Miss Hartley," Charlotte said upon meeting Josephine. "Edmund speaks of you constantly. He says you taught him what real courage looks like." "I think we taught each other," Josephine replied, warming immediately to this woman who would become Edmund's partner. The wedding was beautiful and genuine, Edmund and Charlotte exchanging vows that emphasized partnership and mutual respect. Watching them, Josephine felt a sense of completion, of narrative threads finally woven into something whole and meaningful. At the wedding breakfast, Edmund pulled Josephine aside for a private conversation. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly, "for everything. For your years of service to my family, yes, but more importantly, for showing me that duty without authenticity is hollow, for demonstrating that it is possible to choose differently, even when that choice is difficult." "You found that courage yourself," Josephine replied. "I only provided an example of survival. You provided far more than that." Edmund took her hands. "You are family, Josephine. You always have been, but now it is no longer complicated by employment or obligation. You are simply family, and I hope you know how much that means to me." She embraced him, this man who had been protector and friend, who had given her space to find herself, even when he could not fully understand what she was seeking. "Congratulations, Edmund. I'm so happy you found your Charlotte, and I'm so happy you found your Julian." He released her with a smile. "Now go, before your husband comes looking for you with that intense expression he gets when you are out of his sight for too long." The years that followed were not without challenges. Josephine and Julian faced financial struggles when his commitment to low-fee cases left them sometimes uncertain about making expenses. They endured criticism from those who felt their progressive views were dangerous or inappropriate. They lost cases that mattered, saw injustices persist despite their best efforts, but they also witnessed change, small victories that accumulated into something larger. Women gained property rights through the Married Women's Property Act. Educational opportunities expanded. The conversations about women's suffrage grew louder and more urgent. And through it all, they had each other. Partnership forged not in the golden cage of obligation, but in the difficult, rewarding work of building a life aligned with principles rather than expectations. Their daughter was born in September, a dark-haired child with her mother's grey eyes and her father's fierce intelligence. They named her Catherine Helena, honouring both Lady Catherine and Julian's sister, the women who had shaped their paths to freedom. On the evening of Catherine's christening, with friends and family gathered at their Bath townhouse, Josephine stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the city gold. Julian appeared beside her, their daughter asleep in his arms. Happy? He asked softly. Absurdly so, Josephine replied, leaning against him. It terrifies me sometimes, how much happiness I have found. I keep waiting for it to be taken away. It will not be, Julian said firmly. We built this together, and we will protect it together. That is the beauty of partnership. Neither of us faces the world alone anymore. Josephine looked at her husband, their child, the life they had constructed from courage and principle and love. She thought of the invisible girl she had been at Thornfield, silent and self-erasing, and she marveled at the distance she had travelled. No, she agreed quietly, never alone again. The future still held uncertainties, challenges yet to face, battles yet to fight. But they would meet them together, two people who had refused to accept the limitations others placed upon them and had created, in defiance of expectation, something rare and precious, a life truly their own. 10 years had passed since that chaotic wedding day at St. Margaret's Church, and Bath had transformed from refuge to home for Josephine and Julian Ashworth. Their townhouse, once modest and sparsely furnished, now overflowed with books, children's toys, and the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Catherine had been joined by a brother, William, who at 7 years old possessed his mother's thoughtfulness and his father's argumentative nature, much to their amused delight. Josephine had become a respected voice in educational reform, publishing regular essays and speaking at conferences about progressive pedagogy. Her book, The Education of Free Minds, A Practical Approach to Women's Learning, had been published the previous year to considerable acclaim among reformers and equal controversy among traditionalists. She no longer taught daily at the school, but served as headmistress, shaping policy and curriculum rather than individual lessons. Julian's legal practice had established precedents in women's property rights and employment law. He had argued cases before appellate courts, challenging the legal foundations of women's subordination with patience and strategic brilliance. His reputation as a principled attorney had made him both respected and controversial, exactly as he preferred. On a crisp November morning, they received a letter from Thornfield that would draw them back to Yorkshire once more. Lady Catherine had passed peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, and Edmund requested their presence for the funeral and the reading of the will. She lived a full life, Josephine said, reading Edmund's letter with tears blurring her vision. But I will miss her terribly. For all her severity, she was kind to me when she did not have to be. She was proud of you, Julian said gently, embracing his wife. Her last letter to me mentioned how extraordinary it was that the companion she had employed had become so influential. She said you had exceeded every expectation. They travelled to Thornfield with the children, retracing the journey Josephine had made so many times before. But now she came not as an employee or dependent, but as an equal, a woman of accomplishment and independence. The recognition both satisfied and saddened her. She had wanted this acknowledgement, but she wished Lady Catherine could have seen her this way for longer. Edmund met them at Thornfield's entrance, older now, and weathered by the responsibilities of his position, but genuinely content in a way he had never been during Josephine's years of service. Beside him stood Charlotte, heavily pregnant with their third child, her Irish accent still strong despite years in Yorkshire. Josephine, Julian, thank you for coming so quickly, Edmund said, embracing them both. Mother spoke of you often in her final weeks. I think she wanted to see you one more time, but her health declined too rapidly. The funeral took place 2 days later, a dignified ceremony attended by county families who had watched the Ashworth family's evolution with fascination and occasionally horrified interest. Edmund had become known as a reforming lord, implementing progressive agricultural practices and supporting workers' rights in Parliament. His marriage to Charlotte had produced not scandal, but a genuinely effective partnership, with Charlotte managing much of the estate's charitable work and educational initiatives. At the reception following the service, Josephine encountered faces from her past. Former household staff greeted her with genuine warmth, proud to have known her before her transformation. County ladies who had once barely acknowledged her existence now competed to speak with her, eager to claim association with someone whose writings were being discussed in London salons. The reading of Lady Catherine's will took place in Thornfield's library, the room where Josephine had spent so many hours managing correspondence and household accounts. Edmund's solicitor, a precise man named Hargrove, read the document's provisions with professional neutrality. Most of the estate passed to Edmund, as expected. There were generous bequests to long-serving staff, donations to local charities, small remembrances for distant relatives. Then Hargrove's voice took on a different tone. To Miss Josephine Hartley now, Mrs. Julian Ashworth, who served me faithfully for many years and who exceeded all expectations through her courage, intelligence and principled character, I leave the sum of £5,000. Hargrove paused to let the significant amount register. Additionally, I leave her the complete contents of the Thornfield Library, knowing she will value and preserve them as I did. It is my hope that this bequest provides her with resources to continue her important work in education and reform. Josephine sat speechless, stunned by both the generosity and the recognition implicit in Lady Catherine's words. £5,000 was a fortune, enough to secure her family's financial stability for years, to fund her reform work, to provide opportunities for her children. She was very specific about that bequest, Edmund said quietly after the reading concluded. She spent considerable time drafting the language, wanting to acknowledge not just your service, but your achievements. I think in her way, she was apologizing for not understanding sooner what you were capable of. I am overwhelmed, Josephine managed. I never expected— You should have, Charlotte interjected warmly. Lady Catherine spoke constantly of you in recent years, your writings, your success, your family. She kept every article you published, you know. Edmund found them carefully preserved in her private papers. That evening, alone with Julian in the guest room that had once been far above her station to occupy, Josephine allowed herself to feel the full weight of Lady Catherine's legacy. It was not just money or books, though those were precious. It was recognition, acknowledgement that the invisible girl who had managed households and swallowed indignities had become someone whose work mattered, whose voice carried weight. I wish I could thank her, Josephine said quietly. Tell her that her kindness, even the complicated conditional kindness of my early years here, made this transformation possible. I think she knew, Julian replied, holding her close. And I think this bequest was her way of saying so. They remained at Thornfield for a week, helping Edmund with the countless details of settling his mother's affairs. Josephine spent hours in the library, cataloguing the books that would soon be shipped to Bath. She rediscovered volumes she had read during her years as companion, finding her own faint pencil marks in margins where younger Josephine had noted passages that spoke to her invisible longing for something more. One afternoon, while the children played in Thornfield's gardens under Charlotte's watchful eye, Edmund found Josephine in the library, surrounded by stacks of books. I have been thinking, he said, settling into the chair beside her, about legacy and change and what we leave behind. Deep thoughts for a Tuesday afternoon, Josephine replied with a smile. Mother's death has made me reflective. Edmund picked up one of the books, examining its worn binding. I have been fortunate in my transformation, Josephine. I had resources and position that protected me while I learned to live differently, but so many people lack those advantages. They are trapped as you once were, dependent, invisible, without options. You are building toward a proposal, Josephine observed. I can hear it in your voice. Edmund laughed. You always could read me too well. Yes, I have a proposal. Charlotte and I have been discussing establishing a school here at Thornfield, not just for children of the estate workers, but for young women like you were. Daughters of stewards, governesses, teachers, women with education, but no resources or family connections. We want to provide them with training that would allow them to support themselves independently, whether through teaching, nursing, clerical work, or other respectable professions." He leaned forward, his enthusiasm evident. "And I want you to help design the curriculum, to bring your expertise and experience. You understand what these young women need because you lived it. You know the practical skills and the psychological resilience required to navigate society as a woman without family or fortune." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "Edmund, that is a wonderful vision. Will you help us make it real? You would not need to move back to Yorkshire, of course, but perhaps you could consult, visit regularly, help us establish the programs on sound principles." "Yes," Josephine said without hesitation. "Absolutely yes. This is exactly the kind of work that matters. Not just theory and advocacy, but practical help for women in the most vulnerable positions." The school opened 2 years later, housed in the renovated East Wing of Thornfield Hall. It began with 20 students, young women between 16 and 23, all of them intelligent and ambitious, but lacking the resources to pursue their potential. They learned literature, mathematics, science, bookkeeping, and typing. But they also learned about their legal rights, about how to navigate society as independent women, about the courage required to choose their own paths. Josephine visited twice yearly, teaching intensive seminars and consulting on curriculum development. She watched these young women transform much as she had, observed them gaining confidence and skills, and the revolutionary understanding that they need not accept limitations others placed upon them. Julian's work continued to break new legal ground. He successfully argued a case establishing that women could not be dismissed from teaching positions upon marriage, a precedent that protected the livelihood of thousands of female teachers. He defended women seeking divorce from abusive husbands, challenging the legal presumptions that gave men absolute authority over their wives. Their children grew up immersed in conversations about justice and reform, learning by example that privilege carried responsibility, that comfortable lives could be built on principle rather than exploitation. Catherine showed signs of her mother's intellectual gifts, while William demonstrated his father's passionate commitment to argument and evidence. On a summer evening in 1895, 17 years after that dramatic Christmas Eve ball, Josephine stood before an audience of 300 women gathered for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies conference. She had been invited to speak about education and political participation, to connect her years of work in reform to the larger movement demanding votes for women. "I was born into no particular distinction," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I was the daughter of a steward, dependent on others' charity, invisible to most of the society I served. By every conventional measure, I should have remained in that position, grateful, silent, self-erasing." She paused, letting her eyes travel across the assembled women, teachers and writers, doctors and reformers, all of them fighting in various ways for women's rights and recognition. But I had the extraordinary fortune to encounter people who saw me differently, who recognized that invisibility was imposed rather than inherent, who offered me opportunities to discover what I was capable of when expectations and limitations were removed. She thought of Julian, of Edmund, of Helena and Lady Catherine, and all the others who had contributed to her transformation. The work we do, in education, in law, in politics, is about extending that recognition to all women. It is about dismantling the structures that render women invisible and dependent, that treat our intelligence as ornamental and our ambitions as inappropriate. Her voice strengthened with passion. Every girl should grow up knowing she has options beyond marriage and motherhood, that her mind is as valuable as her appearance, that her voice deserves to be heard. The applause that followed was thunderous, women rising to their feet in recognition of shared struggle and shared hope. Josephine looked out at them and felt the weight of how far she had come. From that silent girl managing Thornfield's household to this moment, speaking to hundreds about transformation and possibility. After the conference, Julian found her in their hotel room, clearly proud. "You were magnificent. Several women approached me to say your speech was the most moving of the entire event." "I only spoke truth," Josephine replied, "about what I have lived and what I have learned. That is why it resonated." Julian pulled her into his arms. "You never speak in abstractions. You speak from experience, and that authenticity is powerful." They returned to Bath, to their full and complicated life. Josephine continued to write, to consult on educational programs, to push boundaries wherever she found them. Julian took on increasingly significant cases, his reputation now solid enough that he could afford to be selective, choosing cases that advanced his principles rather than his income. The Thornfield School flourished, producing graduates who became teachers, nurses, bookkeepers and clerks. Some married, but they did so from positions of independence rather than desperation, choosing partners rather than simply accepting the first acceptable offer. Others remained single, building careers and lives that did not require male approval or support. Edmund and Charlotte became parents to 5 children, raising them with values of equality and justice that would have horrified the previous generation of Ashworths. The estate continued to thrive under Edmund's progressive management, proving that treating workers fairly and investing in community welfare was not just morally correct, but economically sound. Thomas Thornton's fate remained largely unknown. Occasional rumours filtered back from Australia that he had served his sentence and established himself in Melbourne, that he had died in a mining accident, that he had married and produced children who knew nothing of his disgrace. Josephine had long since stopped caring about his particular end. He had been a symptom of systemic injustice rather than its cause, and addressing symptoms while ignoring systems changed nothing fundamental. On Josephine's 40th birthday, surrounded by family and friends in their Bath garden, she found herself reflecting on the architecture of her life. Every choice she had made since leaving Thornfield had been hers, sometimes difficult, sometimes frightening, but always authentic. She had built something remarkable not through rebellion alone, but through the patient work of living according to principle, even when principle was costly. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, appearing beside her with 2 glasses of champagne. "Legacy," Josephine replied. "What we leave behind, beyond wealth or reputation." "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That the most important legacy is possibility, not just for our own children, but for all the young women who come after us, who will have options we helped create, who will stand on the foundation we built and reach higher than we could imagine." She accepted the champagne, touching her glass to his. "We did not change everything, but we changed something. That matters." "It matters enormously," Julian agreed. "Though I suspect you underestimate your impact. Your writings will influence educators for generations. The women you have taught and mentored carry your example forward. The legal precedents we have established create frameworks for future progress." "We did these things together," Josephine corrected gently. "You and I, Edmund and Charlotte, Helena and all the others, no one creates change alone." "True, but partnerships require partners willing to take risks, to choose difficulty over comfort." Julian set down his glass and took both her hands. "Thank you for choosing this uncertain life with me, for building something new rather than accepting what was offered." "Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible," Josephine replied, "for recognizing that the cage was constructed rather than natural." They stood together in the garden as evening fell and guests laughed, and Catherine and William chased each other through the roses. The future still held challenges. The suffrage movement would require decades more struggle before success. Women's legal status remained deeply unequal. Social change came with glacial slowness. But they had proven something essential: that individuals could choose differently, could build lives aligned with principle rather than convention, could create through their daily choices the world they believed should exist. The golden cage was not inevitable. The roles society assigned were not permanent. The invisible could become visible, the voiceless could speak, and transformation was always possible for those brave enough to attempt it. Josephine raised her champagne glass and Julian raised his, and they drank to futures unchosen but created, to cages broken rather than gilded, to lives that were wholly, authentically, courageously their own. The work would continue, but tonight they celebrated how far they had come. If you have been listening to this story, do not forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening. I want to know how far this tale has traveled.